Hi, year 10. How are we doing? We're doing another video. This is the last of this mini section within the dialogues unit because we just kind of done two lessons about medical ethics, about abortion and euthanasia, and this is the last one about fertility treatment. So the title is "What are the arguments for and against fertility treatment?" It's going to be fairly short, I think, and then my plan is to do another video where I kind of do not really an overview, but I like take everything we've done on medical ethics and see how you might answer an exam question, like in a broader exam question. So, what are the arguments for and against fertility treatment? First of all, what is fertility treatment? I'm not going to put a definition on the slides on the video, but you might want to just write this down. Fertility treatment is treatment to help people who are unable to have a baby So, couples who can't get pregnant for whatever reason it is, treatment to help them do that. Now, there are different treatments people can have. Some just involves certain forms of medicine or things like that. We're not going to be looking at those. We're going to be looking mainly at IVF, which we'll talk about what that is. But so we're going to talk mainly about IVF, and most of our arguments are going to be for and against IVF. So that's what fertility treatment is. Basically, this lesson is going to be some key terms that you need to know, and then just the arguments. We're going to go through the arguments for and against IVF. Okay, here are a couple of key terms. There's some videos that we would watch in the class. You can have a look at those videos if you want. They just give you some more information about what these things are. So here are two kinds of fertility treatment that might be worth talking about. IVF is the main one, but there's also another one called AIH, artificial insemination. Why that is, I don't know why it's called AIH, but anyway, that's what it is. So what this means is H means husband, I guess. Artificial insemination by the husband. So this is in some situations where if there's certain medical reasons why the wife can't get pregnant, they take a sperm sample from the husband and use that to make the wife pregnant by injecting it into the reproductive tract. That means it doesn't involve creating the embryo outside of the womb. So that means that the embryo is created inside the woman's womb as normally it would be. It's just that for certain reasons it has to be done with a sample taken from the husband rather than a natural way. IVF is the one that we're going to look at more, and IVF is in vitro fertilization. So for some reasons why people can't get pregnant, that AIH is not possible. So in that situation, fertilization occurs outside the womb and the egg is replaced. So in other words, they take an egg and they take a sample of the husband's sperm and they inject the sperm into the egg, and then that will fertilize the egg. The embryo will start to develop outside the womb, and then at a certain stage they replace the egg into the womb, and then the baby grows in the womb. So that is IVF. What to say about it? So one thing that's not mentioned there is in some cases, if the husband has a condition which means he can't have children in either of those ways, then they can use a sperm donor in both of those things instead. So they could use a sperm donor from someone else who's not one of the couple, if the husband's infertile in the sense that his sperm can't produce children at all. So that's basically what it is. IVF. It used to be called. Babies born by IVF were known in the media as test tube babies. The first one was born in 1978, same year that I was born. So she'll be 41, 42 now, depending on when she was born, what date she was born. So it's something that's kind of happened all within my lifespan. But now obviously it's quite a common thing, quite recognised and normal. There will be people who will be born as a result of IVF, I'm sure. So yeah, the interesting thing, I suppose, is why would anyone be against it? It's not like abortion and euthanasia where you can kind of see why some people are against it straight away. It's kind of clear why, even if you don't agree with them, you can see why people would be against it. With IVF, at first sight, most people are like, well, what's wrong with that? Because look, most couples want to have children. That seems to be the way it is in society. And if people can't have children, it often causes them quite a lot of distress. And so, yeah, IVF helps to take away that distress, that unhappiness. So what's wrong with it? Well, we're going to look at what's wrong with it. Okay, so I should have done that previous slide. You're just supposed to write down those two definitions of IVF and AIH. So then I just want you to put a table in your notes. Reasons to accept IVF, so reasons to say it's okay, and reasons to be against. I'm going to go through the religious reasons first, and you need to have notes on all the religious reasons. There are 4, but I'll explain later why you're going to need 4. When usually, for a 6 mark, you might only need 3. I'll explain why you're going to need all 4 later. For non-religious, I'm going to give 4 to go through. You can make notes on all of them. You can if you want to, but you don't have to. You could just do 2. 2 would be enough for non-religious reasons. Okay, as we go through, it'd be good if you've got 2 different coloured pens. Then you could make notes in one colour pen for the reason, and if you can think of a criticism of the reason, I might go through some criticisms. You could put down a criticism underneath in a different colour pen. So let's go through. Okay, so we're going to start with religious views. Okay, first one. This is actually a religious reason to be in favour of IVF. So here's one reason why some religious people might be in favour. In the Bible, God tells Adam and Eve to be fruitful and increase in number. Christians believe that this means God wants people to have children. Some Christians argue that because of this, IVF should be allowed to couples who cannot have children naturally. So nice and straightforward. You've got a quote there, good bit of evidence. Be fruitful and increase in number. And yeah, if God wants you to have children, if it's good to have children, maybe it'd be good to give treatment to those people who can't have children naturally. So that's one reason to be for it. How would you criticise it? Well, if you don't believe in IVF and you take some other quotes to be against it, then you might say, well, yes, God says to have children, but he doesn't say that. It's kind of almost like picking and choosing from the Bible. He doesn't say have children at all costs. No matter what you do, have children. He means more generally, it's good to have children. If you can't have children, it might be suggested you shouldn't have them, if that makes sense. Okay, it is up to God when a child is born. This is kind of a criticism of the other point, I suppose. So some children argue that it's up to God. So this will be in the against IVF column. Some Christians argue that it's up to God to decide when a child is conceived. They argue that if God has decided a couple cannot have children, they should not go against his wishes by conceiving through IVF. Here's the story that's often told. In the Old Testament of the Bible, it says that Hannah, the wife of Abraham, is not able to have children. And here's the quote, because the Lord had closed her womb. In other words, because God didn't want her to have children. So some Christians believe that shows that God decided who should have children, who should not have children. So yeah, that's often given the reason. God decided this woman shouldn't have children. That suggests that it's up to God. If he decides you shouldn't have children, that's his decision, and you shouldn't go against it. Now, there's an interesting way you can criticise this, I think, and that is in this way. If you argue that it's up to God, if God puts a certain medical condition to you, then it's up to him, and you shouldn't get rid of it. That the same kind of thinking, the same kind of logic could lead people to say, well, okay, if you've got a serious illness, you shouldn't have that illness treated. If you break your leg, God wanted you to break your leg, you shouldn't mend that broken leg, that kind of thing. Now, no Christian believes in that, or very few. And there are some Christians who believe that you should not use. There's a group called, is it Christian Science? Maybe there's some Christian religious group that's founded in America who believes that you should not use medicine and only pray for a cure. But look, the majority of Christians don't believe that at all. The majority of Christians, like everybody, would think if you're ill, go to a doctor. So the point is, if the logic of, oh well, God has given you this condition, therefore you shouldn't alter that condition. It doesn't seem to Christians don't live by that in most of their life. So the idea would be, well, what should they really live like that in the case of pregnancy? So that'd be my criticism of that point of view. Okay, this is probably the biggest argument against IVF, and this is particularly used by Roman Catholics. But I think conservative Protestants might agree as well. So IVF treatment involves fertilizing several eggs. In most cases, 2 of these embryos, sometimes 3 it will be, are inserted into the woman's uterus. The rest are frozen so they can be used if the first attempt is unsuccessful. these spare embryos remain frozen for 10 years, after which they're thrown away. So the reason why they do this, just to give a bit more detail, is because IVF is fairly unsuccessful in terms of percentage chances. So if you fertilize one egg and place that into the woman's body, it's very unlikely. Well, no, not very unlikely. The chances are I think it's about 30%. It's quite low of that embryo surviving, implanting in the lining of the womb, and developing into a fully grown baby. So what they do is to increase the chances, they'll put more than one in at a time. They'll create many embryos. So if you create 10 embryos, and then you try once and you put 3 in, then that makes the chances of there being a successful pregnancy are much higher. But then that might not be successful either. None of them might be successful. So then they might implant another 3, and then that might not be successful when you have another 3. Now, so that's why, as you probably know about this, that with IVF, that it's more common that people are twins or triplets with IVF than with the conventional pregnancy, because if you implant 3 eggs into the womb, yes, there's a chance that none of them survive, and there's a chance that one of them survives, but there is a chance that they could all survive. So sometimes there's twins and triplets are more common in IVF than other kinds of pregnancy. Now, why is this a problem? Well, the problem is that if the person gets pregnant straight away, if the first round of IVF is successful, well then the other embryos are thrown away. They're just discarded. If the parents don't want another child, they'll just take those frozen embryos. They keep them for 10 years, but if the parents don't want to use those eggs after 10 years, they're thrown away. Now, Catholics oppose IVF because they think that life begins at conception. So that means at the point when the egg is fertilized. Therefore, they think that the spare embryos are destroyed. This is the same as taking a human life. So in other words, you're basically murdering children. Say if you implanted 3 eggs, you made 10 fertilized eggs, you implanted 3, and then the pregnancy was successful, then you threw the other 7 away, they would say, well, this is basically murder of 7 fertilized embryos. And so this goes against the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill. It also goes against preserving life, which is one of the purposes of natural moral law. So that's their reason. They say, look, it's not so much the creation of life that they're against, it's the way it's created and the fact that it involves killing fertilized eggs. Now, how can you criticize at this point? Well, one thing you could say is, well, it's possible to do this without killing fertilized embryos. You could just say, we'll just fertilize 1 or 2 eggs, implant them in the womb, and then that means that spare embryos are not destroyed, but obviously that would make the chances of IVF working much lower. A different view comes from the Church of England. They accept IVF and argue that embryos should only be treated as living beings after 14 days of development. This means that discarding some embryos is acceptable. So if they're under 14 days, and that includes this freezing for 10 years, because they're saying if you freeze it, then it stops developing. So they're saying that that they're basically arguing that under 14 days, then you don't have to treat the embryo as a living being, and therefore you can throw some embryos away. So the person might be based on an argument about when life begins, because Catholics believe life begins at conception, but some other Christians might question that and say, well, is that blob of cells really a living being at that point? Okay, last argument about IVF, which is a reason to oppose certain forms of IVF. So Roman Catholics are opposed to any IVF involving donated sperm. So that's means sperm that doesn't come from the father. They see this as a form of adultery, in other words, cheating in a marriage, which goes against the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery. So they're effectively saying that if someone uses a sperm donor, they're cheating on their husband. Now, easy to criticise that one, because some people might say, look, it's nothing to do with, they're not cheating on their husband, they're not actually having a physical relationship with someone else. They're merely using sperm from someone else to create a pregnancy when their husband cannot, if they can't use the husband's sperm. So some people might say it's ridiculous to think that having IVF with sperm donation is in any way similar to adultery. So that can be a criticism at that point. And obviously that is only a criticism of one form of IVF. Okay, let's look at some non-religious arguments. Like I say, you don't need all of these. You can write down all of them if you want, but you need at least two. Okay, Jeremy Bentham. Utilitarians are people who believe in Jeremy Bentham's quote, which is the greatest happiness of the greatest number is the foundation of morals and legislation. So in other words, our decisions about right and wrong, that's morals, and our laws, legislation, should be based on whatever brings the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Now, IVF increases happiness because couples who don't have children are often very unhappy about that, and it will increase their happiness to allow them to have children. So utilitarians would be in favour of IVF for that reason. Here's an interesting one from a non-religious point of view. Cost. IVF is expensive. One course of treatment costs at least £3,000, and many couples need several courses before they conceive a child. I said before that the rate of it working is fairly low. Some people argue that there are more important things for the NHS to spend money on. So this is an argument not against IVF at all, but maybe against funding IVF on the NHS. Because you might say, well, look, there are more important things than IVF. That's a very debatable issue. Some people say if someone wants to get pregnant, it's like a basic human right or something to get pregnant. It's a kind of basic thing that human beings want in life is to have children. Therefore, it should be on the NHS. But other people are more wary about it. They're like, well, these people aren't really ill. There's nothing life-threatening happening here. We should focus our funding of our NHS money on other things, life-threatening diseases and stuff like that, rather than on IVF. Now you might say, well, hold on, how's that going to work? This isn't against IVF; it's just against spending money on IVF. But it depends on how the question is worded. In a 15-mark question, you might be able to use this argument. If you could, your statement could say something like, some non-religious people would not be against IVF in principle, but they might be against funding IVF using the NHS. IVF could lead to designer babies, so this is something that we might look at. I might put a video actually below this a video link below the video on the YouTube channel, because I've got an interesting video where they talk about designer babies. So IVF brings with it the possibility of using genetic manipulation to select embryos based on certain characteristics. Screening embryos can show their gender or the existence of any inherited disorders. Embryos can then be selected so the couple can choose to have a baby of a certain gender or a baby without any inherited physical problems. Some people worry that selecting embryos in this way will lead to designer babies. This is when parents are able to select everything about their baby from its eye colour to its level of intelligence or sexuality. Now, in most cases, what I find in the class, and I suppose this is my view too, is that there are some genetic conditions which it's probably good to screen for. There's some genetic conditions which really lead to a very, very terrible life, lead to a life of just massive suffering. There are some conditions that if someone's born with that genetic condition, they would only have like a year to live, and that year that they lived would be extremely painful. It would just be suffering, basically. And so you can see the idea of like selecting babies to not have certain genetic conditions. It could be a good thing in some situations. However, there's other situations in which it could be much more problematic. Selecting for eye colour, maybe that doesn't seem so weird, but seems strange to me. Selecting for sexuality, intelligence, those kind of things. It's got a feeling of like trying to create a superior kind of child, or trying to say that people who haven't got those genetic traits that the child has are inferior. Those kind of things. So obviously this again isn't a criticism of IVF, but it might be like it's called a slippery slope criticism, saying look, the increased use of IVF can lead to the development of this technology that can lead to designer babies, and designer babies has unfortunate side effects to it. Interesting. I saw an interesting video on on the news recently where someone who was had Down syndrome was on talking about the fact that people are offered a scan to see if their child has Down syndrome when they're pregnant. And the person was basically saying, the fact that people have that scan is routinely offered, and that obviously the intention of that scan is that give people the option of not going ahead with the pregnancy if their child has Down syndrome. That she said she found that incredibly insulting. It kind of made her feel like people didn't feel her life was worth living. I think that's a really interesting point. Are we going down a route through IVF that could lead to choosing genetic characteristics and therefore feeling that people who don't have the whatever are seen to be the right genetic characteristics being badly treated or made to feel not worthwhile? Last one, should everyone be allowed IVF? Again, this isn't an argument so much against IVF as a whole. It's more about should we give IVF to everyone in society? Some people argue that IVF treatment should not be given to certain people such as drug addicts or alcoholics who may not be able to look after their children properly. Some women who have IVF have waited until they're older to have children. It's more difficult to conceive at an older age, so these women often have greater need for IVF. However, IVF is also less likely to be successful for older women. This makes some people think that the NHS should concentrate on encouraging women to have children earlier and not funding IVF for older women. So again, it's all very controversial questions, but yeah, should we be giving IVF to people who we think don't seem to be capable of looking after their children? And yes, should IVF be being used for people who've just waited and wanted to do other things and then have children later? Isn't this a bit of a waste of NHS money because it's less likely to work if you're older, and so on and so on? Controversial question, but interesting one. Okay, that's all the views so far. Make sure you have notes on all the different views. Here's an exam question. You don't have to answer this exam question. Explain why many Christians are opposed to fertility treatment. Now, the reason I told you to write out all the Christian views is that because one of my views was in favour of IVF, one of my views was saying IVF was okay because of be fruitful in increasing number. You wouldn't be able to answer that question properly with only if you didn't have all four views, because you've got to get rid of the one that's in favour and you've got to use the three others as your three SCEs. So you would just go here. One, it's up to God when you have children, not up to you, and you'd use the example of Hannah in the Old Testament. Two, it's IVF involves destroying of embryos that aren't used, unused embryos, and that, according to Catholics, is taking human life because life begins at conception. And three, they might be opposed to IVF, particularly opposed to IVF involving a sperm donor because they see it as a form of adultery. So there'll be your three reasons there. Okay, hope that makes sense. Next video will be like an exam question one on kind of medical ethics as a whole. Okay, remember, if there's any questions you have about any of the work we're doing, please do get in touch. If you're worried about anything in the course and so on, please let me know. Okay, thanks, bye.